Welcome to English 430 and 560. These are the podcasts for Shakespeare's drama, produced by and starring Dr. Bill Dines.
It's likely that The Tempest, which was probably first produced in the year 1611, was the last play that Shakespeare wrote entirely on his own. And for that reason, critics have had a hard time resisting the temptation to parallel Prospero and the author himself. Both men, after all, have complete control over the worlds that they are creating. Both are deeply concerned with the responsibilities and the consequences of that control. And both at play's end say farewell to their art and set aside their power. The problem with this approach, however, is that there is no external evidence that Shakespeare knew this was going to be his very last solo play. And it's almost certainly not the last play that he had a hand in. Both The Two Noble Kinsmen and Henry VIII came later, and while critics wrangle over just how much Shakespeare had to do with those plays, it's obvious that he was involved in their creation. Yet the parallels between Prospero breaking his staff and drowning his books, and Shakespeare leaving London and retiring to his home in Stratford-upon-Avon are a little too difficult to avoid. In 2005, when the great Canadian Shakespearean actor William Hutt decided to retire, the Stratford Festival revived a production of The Tempest for the occasion, so that his final public performance was as Prospero. The effect was riveting throughout that final season. Barring the discovery of Shakespeare's diary, complete with an entry dated winter 1611 and reading, "I quit," I think we have to avoid this overly romantic reading as much as we can, especially because it cuts off so many other valuable approaches. On the one hand, we can see that Shakespeare is continuing to explore themes that he's been interested in throughout his career, themes to which we've returned again and again this semester. He's still interested in the source and the proper use of authority, still fascinated by the performative nature of identity, and he's still intrigued by the role women have to play within a patriarchal culture. Similarly, The Tempest continues the development of fresh ideas and new staging concepts that he's been developing in plays, in this group of plays that critics call his late romances at the end of his career. Action is smaller and more focused. Music and dance have a larger presence. Spectacle often crowds out plot. We talked about the influence that the new Blackfriars Theater had upon Shakespeare's dramaturgy with The Winter's Tale. And I think that those influences are even more pronounced in The Tempest, though it has to be said that The Tempest works extremely well on a large, bare platform stage. In these last plays, Shakespeare's concerned with the relationships between fathers and daughters, especially the redemptive power of a daughter's love. And he's increasingly interested in time, both as a means of transformation and healing, and as a stage device to help structure events. The Tempest is the only Shakespearean play we're reading this semester that observes the classical unities of time, place, and action. The clock starts running when the play begins and doesn't stop or change throughout the course of the play's action. Interestingly, this is not the only play that Shakespeare wrote that follows the three unities. The other is The Comedy of Errors, one of his very first comedies that he probably wrote back in 1592, 1593. The implication is pretty clear. Shakespeare knew that he could work within these limits if he wanted to. And so the fact that he chose not to for most of the plays that he wrote has to be read as an artistic choice. Another reason for resisting the temptation to read The Tempest as Shakespeare's farewell to his art is that this approach obscures for us legitimately new and exciting things that Shakespeare is doing within the play. If he really thought of this as his parting shot, he must have decided to go out swinging. And the figure who stands at the center of much of what is newest and most exciting about this play is the character of Caliban. There is precedent for Caliban in earlier Shakespeare plays, of course. probably the most important is Othello, but Shakespeare's been interested in that figure of the outsider There is precedent for Caliban in earlier plays by Shakespeare, of course. He's been interested in this figure of the outsider at least since There is precedent for Caliban in earlier plays by Shakespeare, of course. Probably the most important is Othello, but Shakespeare has been interested in the figure of the outsider at least since he developed Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, or Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus. We might even include the hunchback king Richard III on this list. But with Caliban, Shakespeare is looking both at the effects of the outsider status has on an individual and on the effects that creating someone as an outsider has upon a society. This is a dynamic relationship that Western society is really only beginning to deal with in the 20th century, following the bitter experience of the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement, and is continuing to negotiate here in the 21st century, most obviously in the ongoing struggles between Christianity and Muslim faith traditions. Now, I'm not claiming that Shakespeare wrote a play that in 1611 that foresaw these kinds of problems, or that really only became relevant in 1945 or in 2001. During the reign of King James I, England's international contacts and global expansion were growing faster than ever. And inevitably, English men and women had to ask themselves, what makes us unique? What draws us together? England had been involved in the African slave trade at least since the 1560s, and after several failed attempts began colonizing what they called the New World in 1607. Increasingly then, the human beings that English merchants and explorers were running into were not simply other white Europeans who happened to speak a different language or worship God in what they thought of as the wrong way, but were people of other colors, other faces, whose speeches sounded like gibberish, and whose way of life wasn't even recognizable as culture. It's easy enough to get sidetracked by the arrogance and ethnocentricity of those early European explorers and exploiters. And I certainly don't want to waste time defending them. But it's important that we look at the relationship between Prospero and Caliban and Prospero and Ariel within the appropriate context. What I hope to do then, as we explore this play in class, is to articulate two rather distinct readings for us to consider. And here I'm interested simply in setting the groundwork for those two readings. For the sake of simplicity, if not accuracy, we can call these readings traditional and modern approaches to the Tempest. The traditional approach assumes that Shakespeare was a man of his time, writing for an audience dazzled by the promise of New World wealth, and fully participatory in the conventional assumptions of the day. In this reading, Shakespeare accepts the notion of European masculine superiority and gives us a Prospero who has the duty, even the responsibility, of bringing civilization to the savage. The modern approach argues that Shakespeare, always skeptical about claims of natural or divinely mandated authority, gives us Caliban, who deserves some respect, if not sympathy, and reveals a Prospero who is in some way damaged by the authority that he has over the native population of the land. In this reading, Prospero's claim that Caliban is congenitally evil and that only Prospero's magic power can keep him in check reveal more to us about Prospero himself than they do about Caliban's true nature. Since this is just an introduction, I'll resist the temptation to develop either of those alternatives in a great deal of detail. You're welcome for that. But if you've been paying attention in class so far this semester, I think it'll be fairly easy for you to guess which of these alternatives approaches I find more attractive. But to clarify the broad outlines, let me take a quick example of a couple of lines from Act 1, Scene 2. The speaker is actually ambiguous. The folio gives this speech to Miranda, but most editors and directors assign it to Prospero. thinking it sounds too harsh for the sweet little girl. At any rate, someone tells Caliban, quote, "I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or another. When thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish, I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known." End quote. I assume that few standing in the yard at the Globe Theater would have had reason to doubt either Miranda or Prospero here. If you've been raised believing that one of the responsibilities that those in authorities have over those who serve them is to provide proper education, well then this gift of language seems natural and commendable. In this reading, of course, Caliban is not only brutish in his initial ignorance, but also in his ungrateful rejection of his superior's gift. His reply at line 363, 364 is, you taught me language, and my profit on it is, I know how to curse. A brute like this, naturally, needs someone of culture and power to control them. Otherwise, he's a threat to everyone around him, even to himself. It seems characteristic of Miranda to pity Caliban. It's much more characteristic of Prospero to abuse Caliban for his ignorance. If this speech is assigned to Prospero, then, it's difficult for modern audiences not to be disgusted by the implicit arrogance here. After all, if Caliban was functioning alone on his island before the Duke and his daughter arrived, what did Prospero have to teach him except how to do his bidding? What makes Prospero's language superior to what he calls Caliban's gabbling? In this approach, Prospero's treatment of Caliban isn't a natural or necessary exercise of God-given authority. It's not a matter of everyone finding his or her proper place on that cosmic great chain of being. Rather, it's a colonist's exploitation of a native people, and we've had several centuries to watch how that little process plays itself out. We'll see some of these consequences in the play itself, I think. Now, I've been stressing the word natural in this discussion, and that's intentional. One of the hearts of this play is a problem that we've been wrestling with at least since King Lear, and that's the question, what is natural about the human condition? When you strip away the trappings of culture and education, when you get down to what Lear calls the thing itself, unaccommodated man, what do you have? Both Caliban and Miranda were raised in isolation on a nearly deserted island. Is one a better representation of the natural human self than the other? If so, what does this suggest about all those trappings and embellishments of culture? What good do we get from kings or presidents, from fine robes, fancy iPods, from art like music or painting or plays?